November 20th, 2019. Huntsville, Texas. The gurney sits empty. It should be occupied right now by a 51-year-old black man named Rodney Reed, but it's not. The leather straps dangle loose. The four-stand stands ready with lines that will never be used tonight. In the witness rooms, reporters check their phones. Family members shift uncomfortably in plastic chairs. Some came here believing they'd finally see justice served after 23 years. Others came hoping to witness what they believe would be state-sanctioned murder. None of them are getting what they expected. The warden received the call 2 hours ago. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay. Not a pardon, not an exoneration. Just more time to examine evidence in a case that's already consumed over 2 decades. Rodney Reed was supposed to be executed at 6 p.m. today. Instead, he's still in a cell on death row, still claiming he's innocent of murdering 19-year-old Stacey Stites in 1996. Still saying the real killer is walking free. But here's what nobody in that witness room knew. This case was about to explode into something much bigger than anyone imagined. But to understand why Rodney Reed's execution never happened, we need to go back to where this all started. April 23rd, 1996. Bastrop County, Texas, about 30 miles southeast of Austin. Rural roads, small communities where everybody knows everybody. The kind of place where a murder doesn't just shock a neighborhood, it shakes an entire county. That morning, a truck driver spotted something that would haunt this quiet corner of Texas for the next 3 decades. Lying in tall grass beside Farm Road 1441 was the body of Stacey Stites. She was 19 years old, worked at H-E-B grocery store, and was supposed to get married in just a few weeks to her fiancé, Jimmy Fennell, a local police officer. Stacey never made it to her wedding. She never made it home from work that night. What happened to her would divide this community along racial lines, launch international campaigns, and put the entire Texas justice system under a microscope. Here's what makes this case different from every other true crime story you've heard. It's not over. While you're watching this, Rodney Reed is still sitting in a cell on Texas death row, still fighting for his life, still maintaining his innocence after 28 years behind bars. And the evidence that could prove him right or wrong, most of it has never been properly tested. This isn't just about one man's guilt or innocence anymore. Celebrity activists, international human rights organizations, and millions of people worldwide have rallied behind Reed's cause. The case has exposed cracks in the criminal justice system that run deeper than anyone imagined. But there's another side to this story, a side that believes justice was served correctly, that the right man sits on death row, and that all this attention is just noise. Tonight, we're going to examine every piece of evidence, every witness, every twist in a case that refuses to die. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. on April 23rd, 1996. A truck driver had spotted what he thought was a mannequin in the grass along Farm Road 1441. It wasn't. Stacey Stites had been missing for about 8 hours. She was supposed to work the early morning shift at H-E-B, starting at 3:30 a.m. When she didn't show up, her supervisor tried calling. No answer. Her fiancé, Jimmy Fennell, told police he last saw her around midnight when she left for work, unusually early, even for a morning shift. The crime scene told a brutal story. Stacey had been taken from her red Nissan pickup truck, which was found about a mile away from her body. Her work uniform was scattered nearby. The medical examiner determined she'd been strangled with her own belt. But here's what made this case particularly challenging for investigators. There were no witnesses, no clear suspects, and very little physical evidence that pointed at anyone specific. In a small community where serious crimes were rare, the Bastrop County Sheriff's Department found themselves investigating the kind of case that usually only happens in big cities. The one thing they did have was biological evidence. DNA technology was still relatively new in 1996, but what they collected from Stacey's body would eventually become the centerpiece of the entire case. For now, though, it just sat in evidence storage while detectives chased dead ends. Jimmy Fennell had an alibi that seemed bulletproof. He was a police officer. He was grieving his murdered fiancé, and he was cooperating fully with investigators. But behind closed doors, detectives were asking uncomfortable questions. Why did Stacey leave for work at midnight? Her shift didn't start until 3:30 a.m. That's 3.5 hours early. Even her most dedicated co-workers thought that was strange. The drive to HEB took 20 minutes, tops. When pressed, Fennell explained that Stacey sometimes liked to go in early. She was ambitious, hardworking, but midnight? Really? Then there were the inconsistencies in his statements. Small things at first. The exact time she left, whether they'd argued recently, what she was wearing when he last saw her. The investigation was going nowhere fast. This was rural Texas in 1996. The sheriff's department had limited resources. No surveillance cameras. No cell phone pings. Just old-fashioned detective work in a case that desperately needed modern solutions. But 13 months later, modern technology finally caught up with the Bastrop County Sheriff's Department. The DNA results came back from the state lab, and everything changed. They had a match. March 1997. The phone call that changed everything. We got a hit in Cody's. The DNA found inside Stacey Stites matched a man named Rodney Reed. But here's the thing that made investigators do a double take. Reed wasn't some random drifter or known criminal they'd been tracking. He wasn't even on their radar. He was a 29-year-old black man living in Bastrop. He worked construction. He had a girlfriend. He had absolutely no connection to Stacey Stites that anyone could find. No mutual friends. No workplace connection. Nothing. When detectives knocked on Reed's door, his reaction was immediate and definitive. I don't know who that is. I've never seen that woman in my life. But the DNA doesn't lie, right? That's what prosecutors would later argue. Scientific evidence. Cold, hard facts. Except here's what most people don't realize about this case. But before we dive deeper, I need you to comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to reveal about Rodney Reed's next move is going to sound absolutely insane no matter what country you're in. And if you think DNA evidence is foolproof, drop an emoji in the comments, because you're about to learn why that might be the biggest lie you've ever been told. And if you're not subscribed to this channel, you're going to miss the shocking details that true crime documentaries conveniently leave out. The evidence we're about to reveal will make you question everything you think you know about DNA, alibis, and what really happened that night. Hit that subscribe button now, because what comes next will blow your mind. April 2nd, 1997. Rodney Reed was at home when the knock came. Bastrop County Sheriff's Department. We need to talk. Reed stepped outside, probably thinking this was routine. Maybe they were canvassing the neighborhood about something. But when Detective Daryl Bowes started asking about Stacey Stites, Reed's response was immediate and unwavering. I don't know anybody by that name. They brought him to the station anyway. Sat him in that small interrogation room with the flickering fluorescent light and the two-way mirror. For hours they pressed him, showed him Stacey's photograph, asked if he'd ever been to the HEB where she worked, ever driven down Farm Road 1441, where her body was found. Every answer was the same. No, never seen her, don't know her, never been there. Then Detective Bowes dropped the hammer. Your DNA was found inside her body. The silence in that room must have been deafening. Reed's entire world just imploded with 7 words. His construction job, his girlfriend, his normal life, all of it hanging by a thread now connected to a dead woman he claimed never to have met. Reed was arrested and charged with capital murder. Three months into his incarceration, Rodney Reed's lawyer came to visit him with some devastating news. The DNA evidence was rock solid. The state was seeking the death penalty. They had an airtight case. That's when Reed said something that would split this case wide open. I did know her. We were having an affair. Wait, what? The same man who spent hours in that interrogation room swearing he'd never seen Stacey Stites suddenly remembered a secret relationship? His attorney probably thought he was losing his mind. But Reed's story was detailed. He claimed he and Stacey had been seeing each other for about a year. Secret meetings. Hidden from everyone because she was white, engaged to a police officer, and this was East Texas in the 1990s. Interracial relationships weren't just frowned upon, they could be dangerous. According to Reed, they had been together intimately the night before her death. That's how his DNA ended up inside her body. Not from rape, from consensual sex. The problem? Reed had 3 months to come up with this story. 3 months sitting in a cell, knowing the DNA evidence would destroy him. 3 months to craft a narrative that could save his life. When word leaked about Reed's affair claim, Bastrop County erupted. The white community was outraged. The black community was divided. And Jimmy Fennell? He was furious, calling Reed a liar who was dishonoring Stacey's memory. May 1998, Bastrop County Courthouse. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Rodney Reed was a predator who abducted, assaulted, and murdered an innocent woman. The DNA proved sexual contact. Reed's initial denials proved consciousness of guilt. Case closed. But Reed's defense team had a different story to tell. They painted a picture of forbidden love in a town where interracial relationships could get you killed. Secret meetings. Hidden passion. A relationship so dangerous it had to stay buried until Reed's life depended on revealing it. The problem was witnesses. Who could verify a secret affair that was supposedly hidden from everyone? Reed's defense struggled to produce concrete evidence of the relationship beyond Reed's own testimony. The jury, 11 white members and 1 black member, had to decide between 2 impossible stories. Was Reed a cold-blooded killer who happened to invent the perfect cover story? Or was he a man whose secret love affair became a death sentence when that love was discovered? On May 29, 1998, after just 5 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back. Guilty of capital murder. The courtroom erupted. Reed's family screamed. Stacey's family wept with relief. And somewhere in that chaos, the truth, whatever it was, remained buried under the weight of reasonable doubt that apparently wasn't quite reasonable enough. Reed was sentenced to death. While Rodney Reed sat on death row, something interesting was happening to Jimmy Fennell, the grieving fiancé who had captured everyone's sympathy. In 2007, 9 years after Reed's conviction, Fennell was arrested, not for Stacey's murder, for something else entirely. He had kidnapped and sexually assaulted a woman while on duty as a Georgetown police officer. The assault happened in his patrol car. He used his badge and authority to commit the crime. But here's what makes this relevant to our story: the psychological profile. Fennell didn't just assault this woman. He showed a pattern of behavior that criminal psychologists recognize: control, manipulation, using his position of power to dominate women. Fellow officers began coming forward with stories they'd kept quiet for years. Fennell had a temper, they said, especially when it came to women. There were whispers about domestic incidents, about his jealousy, about how he couldn't handle the idea of anyone else being with his woman. One retired officer told investigators that Fennell had once said something chilling about interracial relationships. Any woman who would sleep with a black man deserves to die. Let that sink in. The man who had been portrayed as a heartbroken fiancé was now serving 10 years in prison for sexual assault. And suddenly, his behavior around the time of Stacey's death looked different. The timeline he gave, his emotional responses, the way he described their relationship. What if the real killer had been hiding in plain sight the whole time? What if everyone had been so focused on the DNA evidence that they missed the actual predator standing right there in the courtroom, wearing a suit and playing the victim? Something remarkable started happening in the early 2000s. People who had stayed silent for years began stepping forward with a different version of events. Arthur Snow, who had worked with Stacey at HEB, signed an affidavit stating he knew about her relationship with Reed. He said Stacey had told him she was seeing someone her fiancé didn't know about, a black man from town. Then came Ruby Sessions, a cousin of Stacey's. She claimed Stacey had confided in her about the affair. Said Stacey was scared of what Jimmy would do if he found out. More witnesses followed. Neighbors who said they'd seen Reed's truck near Stacey's apartment. Co-workers who remembered Stacey acting nervous in the weeks before her death, constantly looking over her shoulder. But here's the pattern that emerges when you dig deeper. Most of these witnesses said they were afraid to come forward during the original investigation. Afraid of Jimmy Fennell. Afraid of the police department. Afraid of what might happen in a small Texas town if they supported the affair story. One witness, who asked to remain anonymous, told Reed's legal team, everyone knew Jimmy had a temper. Everyone knew he hated the idea of interracial relationships. You don't cross a man like that, especially when he's wearing a badge. The fear was real. The intimidation was systematic. And the truth? It had been there all along, buried under layers of terror that ran deeper than anyone imagined. What you're hearing right now is just the tip of the iceberg. The evidence pointing to Jimmy Fennell gets so much more damning. And if you think the story is shocking now, wait until you hear what happened when investigators try to dig deeper into Fennell's past. Drop a man police officer in the comments if you think cops can get away with anything. Because what we uncover next about police cover-ups will make your blood boil. Subscribe and ring that notification bell. Because the next part of this series will reveal evidence so explosive, it could have changed everything. Don't let these stories disappear into the darkness. Hit subscribe now. November 2019. The clock was ticking. Rodney Reed had 23 days left to live. 23 sunrises. 23 chances to prove his innocence. The calendar on death row becomes your worst enemy, when every page you tear off brings you closer to the gurney. His legal team was in overdrive, filing appeals, requesting DNA tests, presenting new witness testimonies. But Texas has a reputation for carrying out executions, and Reed's case had already been through the appeals process multiple times. Then something unexpected happened. Hollywood started paying attention. Kim Kardashian tweeted to her 62 million followers about Reed's case. Rihanna shared a story. Oprah spoke out. Suddenly, a case that had been buried in Texas legal proceedings was trending worldwide on social media. Hashtag Rodney Reed became a rallying cry. Protesters gathered outside the Texas state capitol. International human rights organizations issued statements. European Parliament members wrote letters to the Texas governor. But the clock kept ticking. 15 days. 10 days. 7 days. The media circus outside the Walls unit in Huntsville was unlike anything the prison had seen. Satellite trucks lined the streets. Reporters from around the world camped outside, waiting for what many believed would be Reed's final moments. You're watching a man's final week of life play out on television, his family members giving interviews through tears, his legal team filing last-minute Hail Mary petitions, prison officials preparing the death chamber while protesters chant outside the gates. 5 days. 3 days. Tomorrow, Reed's final meal was ordered. The chaplain made his visits. The gurney was prepared. Everything was set for November 20th, 2019 at 6 p.m. But sometimes, justice moves in mysterious ways. November 15th, 2019. 5 days before the scheduled execution. The phone call that changed everything came from the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Reed's legal team had been granted an indefinite stay of execution to review new evidence. Inside his cell, Reed collapsed to his knees. 21 years on death row, and he'd just been pulled back from the edge. His sister Roderica later described the phone call. He was crying. We were all crying. It felt like we could breathe again. But outside the prison gates, the reaction was split down the middle. Protesters who had been calling for Reed's freedom erupted in celebration. Car horns honked. People hugged strangers. Someone started singing gospel songs and the crowd joined in. On the other side of the street, Stacey Stites' family stood in stunned silence. They had come to Texas believing they would finally see justice served after 23 years of waiting. Instead, they watched Reed supporters celebrate what felt like another slap in the face. The media frenzy intensified. International news outlets covered the stay as a victory for criminal justice reform. But in Bashop County, where Stacey was murdered, many residents felt like the system had failed them once again. But the stay of execution wasn't freedom. It was just more time. Reed's legal team continued fighting for additional DNA testing of crime scene evidence that had never been properly analyzed. The state kept refusing. Appeals were filed and rejected. Hope rose and fell with each court decision. In 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court dealt a crushing blow. They rejected Reed's petition without comment. No explanation. No reasoning. Just no. Today, as you're watching this, Rodney Reed is still sitting in that same cell on Texas death row, still proclaiming his innocence, still waiting for someone to test the evidence that could prove him right or wrong. The clock that stopped ticking on November 20th, 2019, it's ticking again, and time is running out. Again. Here's the question that should keep everyone awake at night. Why won't they test all the evidence? Picture this. You're facing execution, and there's a box sitting in a storage facility that might contain proof of your innocence. But every time your lawyer's asked to open that box, the answer is no. Every single time. Reed's legal team has been fighting for comprehensive DNA testing of multiple pieces of evidence from the crime scene. The belt used to strangle Stacey, her fingernails, additional biological material, items that weren't tested back in 1996 because the technology wasn't advanced enough. But here's where it gets infuriating. The state of Texas keeps saying no. Their argument? The DNA testing that was done is sufficient. Reed's guilt was established. No need to waste resources on additional testing. Reed's argument? If you're so confident I'm guilty, what are you afraid the test will show? Think about this logically. If additional DNA testing would confirm Reed's guilt, wouldn't the state want that extra proof? Wouldn't it shut up all the protesters and celebrities once and for all? Unless they're not sure what those tests might reveal. Modern DNA technology is light years ahead of what existed in 1996. We can now extract usable DNA from trace amounts that would have been impossible to analyze back then. We can separate mixed samples. We can identify partial profiles. So why the resistance? What exactly are they protecting? But the DNA isn't the only problem with this case. The timeline has holes you could drive a truck through. According to the prosecution, Stacey was abducted sometime after midnight on April 23rd, assaulted and murdered. They built their entire case around this timeline. But here's where it falls apart. The medical examiner determined Stacey's time of death was between 2:30 and 4:30 a.m. However, lividity patterns, the way blood settles in a dead body, suggest that she had been lying in that position for much longer than the prosecution claimed. Reed's defense experts argued that based on the physical evidence, Stacey could have died as early as 10 p.m. the previous night. That's a massive difference. And if she died at 10 p.m., Reed couldn't have been involved because he was provably somewhere else. The prosecution dismissed these findings, but multiple forensic pathologists have since reviewed the case and reached similar conclusions. The state's timeline doesn't match the physical evidence. Here's what really bothers people. When you have as many inconsistencies in a death penalty case, shouldn't that trigger a deeper investigation? When the time of death could be off by 6 hours, shouldn't someone want to figure out what actually happened? Here's what keeps me up at night about this case, and why this channel exists. There's evidence sitting in storage that could prove Rodney Reed's innocence or guilt once and for all. But powerful people don't want it tested. Comment below if you think everyone deserves the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people in power. By subscribing to this channel, you're supporting investigations into cases like this where the truth is being deliberately buried. We expose what others won't touch. Don't let them silence these stories. Subscribe now and help us bring light to the darkness. What started as a local Texas case suddenly became a global phenomenon, and it happened faster than anyone expected. Kim Kardashian's tweet reached 62 million followers in minutes. The evidence that could exonerate Rodney Reed is being ignored. This is not justice. Rihanna followed with her own post to 107 million fans. Beyoncé shared Reed's story. Even Oprah spoke out on her platform. But this wasn't just celebrity virtue signaling. These advocates brought real attention to specific evidence. They highlighted the untested DNA. They questioned Jimmy Fennell's criminal conviction. They amplified the voices of witnesses who have been ignored for decades. The hashtag Rodney Reed started trending worldwide. Instagram stories, TikTok videos, Twitter threads breaking down the case piece by piece. Suddenly, millions of people who had never heard of Bastrop County, Texas, were demanding answers about a 1996 murder case. Celebrity influence transformed Reed from an unknown death row inmate into an international cause. And with that attention came something Reed hadn't had in 20 years: hope. Then the heavy hitters arrived. The Innocence Project, the organization that has exonerated 375 wrongfully convicted people through DNA evidence, took on Reed's case. When they get involved, people pay attention because their track record is undeniable. Here's what makes their involvement terrifying for the prosecution. The Innocence Project doesn't just take any case. They have a rigorous screening process. They only pursue cases where they believe there's substantial evidence of actual innocence. And they found patterns in Reed's case that they'd seen before. Rushed investigations. Witnesses afraid to come forward. Alternative suspects with violent histories being overlooked. DNA evidence that tells a different story than the prosecution's narrative. Most chilling? They discovered that Texas leads the nation in death row exonerations. Since 1973, 16 people on Texas death row have been proven innocent and released. 16 people who came within hours or days of being executed for crimes they didn't commit. Reed could be number 17. Or he could be guilty. The Innocence Project was determined to find out which. The ripple effects went far beyond social media. Protests erupted in London, Paris, and Berlin. European Parliament members wrote formal letters to Texas Governor Greg Abbott demanding clemency. Over 3 million people signed online petitions calling for Reed's execution to be stopped. But the most powerful moment came from an unexpected source. Death row inmates in other countries began speaking out. Men and women facing execution in Japan, Singapore, and Iran cited Reed's case as evidence that the death penalty system is fundamentally broken. Reed's story became a rallying point for abolitionists worldwide. His face appeared on protest signs from Dublin to Tokyo. International news outlets ran investigative pieces questioning not just Reed's guilt, but the entire American justice system. Texas found itself under a global microscope, and the world was watching every move they made. After everything we've uncovered, here's what should terrify you. We still don't know the truth. 28 years later, the most crucial evidence remains untested. The belt that strangled Stacey Stites sits in storage, potentially holding DNA that could identify her real killer. Her fingernails, which might contain skin cells from her attacker, have never been properly analyzed with modern technology. Jimmy Fennell's violent history raises questions that were never fully investigated. Why wasn't his behavior pattern explored during the original trial? Why didn't anyone dig deeper into his psychological profile when the affair allegations surfaced? And then there's a timeline that doesn't add up. If Stacey died hours earlier than the prosecution claimed, what does that do to their entire case? Where was everyone during those missing hours? But here's the human cost of all this uncertainty. Rodney Reed has spent over 2 decades on death row for a crime he may not have committed. That's 8,000 nights lying awake, knowing tomorrow might be his last day. That's missing his children growing up, watch his parents age through prison glass, living in a 6x9 cell while the real killer potentially walks free. And if Reed is guilty, then justice was served, but only by accident, not by thorough investigation. So let me ask you something that's going to make you uncomfortable. What is justice? Is it executing someone based on DNA evidence and a jury verdict, even when crucial evidence remains untested? Is it better to risk killing an innocent man than to admit the system might have failed? Or is justice making absolutely sure, testing every piece of evidence, investigating every lead, questioning every assumption, before we take a life that can never be given back? Here's what haunts me about this case. If we execute Rodney Reed and then discover evidence proving his innocence, we can't undo that mistake. We can't apologize to a dead man. We can't give him back the decades he lost or reunite him with his family. But if Reed is guilty and we delay his execution to ensure we have the right man, the only cost is time and resources. Stacey Stites will still be gone. Her family's pain won't increase. The real victim, if Reed is the killer, isn't harmed by thorough investigation. The price of being wrong in one direction is irreversible. The price of being wrong in the other direction is what? Spending money on DNA tests? Taking time to investigate properly? Which risk are you comfortable with? Which mistake can you live with? Because right now, you're being asked to accept that we have the right man based on evidence that's incomplete, witnesses who are afraid to speak, and an investigation that may have focused on the wrong suspect from day one. Remember that execution chamber we started with? The one prepared for November 20th, 2019? The gurney still sits there in Huntsville, waiting. The leather straps that were meant to hold Rodney Reed down remain unused. The 4 lines that never found his veins are coiled in storage. But Reed's cell on death row isn't empty. He's still there, still breathing, still waiting for someone to test the evidence that could prove his innocence or confirm his guilt. That execution chamber tells the story of a system that came within hours of potentially making an irreversible mistake. And the scariest part? It's still possible. Reed could be transferred back to that room at any time. The clock is still ticking. Rodney Reed is still on death row as you watch this, still fighting for his life, still claiming his innocence. If you leave this video without subscribing, you're walking away from stories like this. Stories where your engagement, your voice, your subscription could be the difference between truth and silence. Drop a balance scale in the comments if you believe everyone deserves a complete truth, no matter how long it takes to find it. We can't bring back the years Rodney has lost, but we can make sure his story and others like it are never forgotten. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because justice delayed shouldn't mean justice denied.